Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this UK Squirrel Accord webinar for the International Day of Forests. It's quite apt as we come to the end of our tree planting season in the UK that we take time to reflect on our trees, woods and forests and their importance for people and wildlife. I'm Kay Hoare, and today I'm joined by three expert speakers looking at woodland habitats, red squirrels and pine martens. Louise de Raad is Head of Research Scotland for the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. Heinz Traut is Project Manager for Red Squirrels Northern England, and Josh Twining is Postdoctoral Research Scientist at Cornell University. We'll hear from each of our speakers first and then move on to a question and answer session afterwards. Thanks to all those of you who've already sent in questions during the registration. If there's anything that comes up during the presentations that you wish to ask, please put your questions in the question and answer section of the Zoom facilities. Do use the chat function to say hello, pass on any comments or talk between each other, but try and keep any questions, the question and answer section, just so I can keep track of them all and we can try and get through them all at the end. Okay, without further ado, I'll pass to our first speaker, who's Josh, who's going to be looking at habitats, pine martens and red grey squirrel interactions.
Hi everyone, thank you for the introduction, Kay. My name's Josh Twining and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today on International Forest Day. I'm going to be talking about some of research myself and my collaborators have been working on alongside a massive volunteer team of citizen scientists since 2014. And whilst I might be the one talking to you today, this is by no means a solo effort, and I'm extremely grateful to all my co-authors and every single citizen scientist who made this work possible. So the focus of my talk today is going to be on the interactions of a native predator, a threatened native prey, and an established invasive species, and the role of habitat and how we manage our landscapes and woodlands in mediating or changing the outcomes of the interactions between these animals, and what this means for red squirrel conservation. So to get us started, I'm going to give a brief history of squirrels in Britain and Ireland. Most of you are probably going to be very familiar with this, so I'll keep it relatively brief. Red squirrels on the left here are obviously native to Britain and Ireland. They're woodland specialists and they've thrived in the forests of these islands for millennia. However, things took a dire turn for the red squirrel at the turn of the 20th century, following the introduction of the grey squirrel to both Britain and Ireland. As a North American native, greys were brought over and introduced as gifts to the landed gentry. Well adapted to the mild temperate climates here, they thrived in the estates they were released into and quickly became established. Since their introduction, they've continued to spread, expand and replace our native red squirrels. And this replacement is due to a number of factors, including their larger body sizes, being approximately twice the mass of a red squirrel, living at much higher densities, and a number of behavioral differences that typically give them a competitive edge. But most important of all is the fact the grey squirrel is a reservoir host for a viral pathogen, the squirrelpox virus. And so as a reservoir host, all this means is that the grey squirrels carry this disease that they themselves are immune to, but can pass it on to red squirrels, in which it causes high levels of mortality. And so due to this myriad of reasons, there have been numerous historical control programs. Now, despite their importance and the incredible efforts of dedicated armies of volunteers, whether these have been through trapping or shooting or warfaring poisoning, the majority have been met with relatively limited success at a landscape scale. And due to the continuing and prolific spread of grey squirrels, even in the face of large-scale control efforts and highly valuable volunteer time, for a long time, conversations about red squirrel conservation in both Britain and Ireland became about when, not if, the red squirrel would go extinct, and how we could slow that down. And the primary means of doing this in both Ireland and in Scotland has been through stronghold management strategies. Approaches focused on planting large blocks of typically non-native conifer species, for example, Sitka spruce, Norway spruce, where red squirrels are thought to have a competitive advantage and can persist for far longer compared to other woodland types. But in recent years, something has changed. The protagonist of this story might be known to many of you. Enter the pine marten, to the brink and back again. So the pine marten is a small carnivore, another native to Britain and Ireland and native throughout Europe. But on these islands, the pine marten underwent severe historical decline, driven by both habitat loss and persecution, and was almost wiped out in the most recent nadir. So you can see here maps of Ireland going from the 1970s onwards. You can see by the 1970s and 80s, pine marten had been extirpated throughout almost all of Ireland and were clinging on in remnant populations on the western seaboard counties. And this same pattern occurred in Britain, with the pine marten being eradicated locally throughout much of the island, apart from strongholds in the very northern reaches of the Scottish Highlands, and again, a few remnant populations scattered throughout the rest of Britain. But the species have witnessed a remarkable recovery. Following being granted legal protection, again in the 70s and 80s, recovery was slow at first, thought to be inhibited by the low forest cover present on both islands. Britain and Ireland have some of the lowest forest cover in Europe, sitting between 10 and 20%. And in both Scotland and Ireland, over 75% of our low forest cover is made up of conifer plantations. So really we live in heavily human modified landscapes, even in the contemporary context of ubiquitous human impacts globally. But nevertheless, as you can see from these maps here, where the black squares are indicating occurrence of the pine marten over time, we see that in the last 15 years, the populations have really bounced back. And by 2019, the pine marten now occurred in all 32 counties in the island of Ireland. And whilst these maps are focusing on Ireland, Scotland has been witnessing a similar, if not slightly delayed, recovery in marten numbers, with pine marten now occurring throughout much of Scotland and naturally recolonising into Northern England. So there's been a great deal of really fantastic research on the interactions of these three species. And I'm really grateful to stand on the shoulders of giants when I talk to you today. So what started as anecdotal reports of grey squirrels disappearing where pine martens reappeared in the Irish Midlands is rapidly becoming a model system for the benefits of predator recovery on native biodiversity. So the first large quantitative investigation onto the interactions of these three species was led by my friend and colleague, Emma Sheehy. So Emma used non-invasive genetic sampling of the three species at 3 sites across the recovery front in Scotland, which vary in time since recolonisation, from strongholds in the Scottish Highlands all the way down to just recently recovered in the border regions. And what they found was a negative relationship between pine marten presence, pine marten connectivity, and grey squirrel occurrence. And that locally, at least, they demonstrate this to be a density-dependent relationship. So at the sites they were working at, where pine martens were returning, grey squirrels were disappearing and red squirrels were recovering. Now, off the back of Emma's work, we worked on a landscape scale survey in Ireland using camera traps. And we were able to demonstrate a similar pattern on a regional scale. So the same processes and benefits of predator recovery were occurring across both of these two varied ecosystems. So what we're seeing here on both local and landscape scales are pine martens having negative effects on invasive grey squirrels to the positive, to the gain of our native red squirrels. But no one had yet tried to predict the outcome of pine marten recovery on grey squirrels in heterogeneous landscapes, so in landscapes that are highly human modified. And this is because it's difficult. When we think about species interactions, we often view them as simple pairwise interactions. How does this predator affect this prey species? How does this competitor affect the species it's competing with? But these interactions are actually embedded in these complex networks of both direct and indirect interactions between multiple species and the environments they live in. And so you have these confounding effects of indirect interactions between the animals themselves and the habitats they reside in. And this makes predicting the consequences of either species invasion or predator recovery particularly challenging, especially in landscapes which are greatly modified by human activity. So why does habitat matter? Why does it make things more difficult? How can it affect interactions? Well, habitat is the determining factor in the density and hunting capacity of predators, and also in the ability of prey to detect, avoid, and escape predators, and have access to refuges. So here you can see some diagrammatic illustrations of what might be the expected interaction networks between pine martens and squirrels in the two main habitat types available to them in Ireland. So you've got native broadleaf woodlands on the left. So you can think of these as natural woodlands, usually formed of species such as oak and ash and hazel. They're going to be structurally complex habitats with multi-layered canopies, large diameter veteran trees, supporting refuge providing cavities. And then on the right, we've got our conifer plantations. And then again, these make up the majority of forests in Ireland and Scotland. And these forests are usually rather one-dimensional. They're typically made up of single species, mostly Sitka spruce. They're planted in rows. They're subject to rotational clear felling approximately every 30 years when those trees get mature, because to harvest the timber crop. And generally, they're very structurally simple and rather one-dimensional. And so in the native broadleaf woodlands, you can see we expect to have these rather complex, intact ecosystems. Not only do we have both squirrel species present, we have a variety of other small mammal prey in the form of shrews and mice. If you're in Scotland, that might be voles as well. We've got an abundance of birds, a variety of fruits, all of these different key resources for any omnivorous predator, especially the pine marten. And so perhaps in these more complex habitats where you've got this greater diversity of prey, you've got abundance of refuges in the cavities of these old gnarled oaks, we might expect predation pressures to be less on the native red squirrel following pine marten recovery. Whilst in the simpler habitats that support a lower abundance of wildlife and have less above ground refuges, we might expect the impacts to be higher. And so we formed a series of hypotheses we wanted to look into based on what we thought the role of forest type and habitat might be on these species. And so we hypothesized that the impact of the pine marten on the grey squirrel was going to be consistent regardless of the local habitat. So no matter what sort of woodland they were in, we thought pine martens were going to control numbers of grey squirrels. And we believe this because it's been demonstrated that grey squirrels lack anti-predator behaviours to the pine marten, which facilitates higher predation rates. So we think grey squirrels are going to be a profitable food item no matter what habitat you're in. And pine martens are generalists, so they're going for what's abundant, what's available, what's easy to catch. And so this sits in line with our reasoning here. Our second hypothesis is that the interactions between the red squirrel and the pine marten are going to be dynamic and habitat specific. And we're going to see more benefits in more structurally complex habitats and potentially more adverse impacts in more simplified man-made habitats. And finally, the third hypothesis we want to look at was that the competitively linked native and invasive prey species interactions are also going to be mediated by habitat. And this is really what underpins the current stronghold management plans, the fact that red squirrels should be better adapted to the small-seeded cones that are found in conifer plantations, as opposed to broadleaf forests where they're much more quickly replaced because grey squirrels can access the masting seeds quicker and reach far higher densities. And so to tackle these sorts of questions, we've got some really useful models known as occupancy models. Now, without going too much into the nitty-gritty, these are a subset of hierarchical model. And what they allow us to do is they allow us to estimate the probability that an animal occurs in an area under certain conditions, whilst accounting for what we call imperfect detection. So imperfect detection is the idea that whilst I might go out and conduct a survey for an animal, not detecting that animal during the survey doesn't mean it's not present. And so by accounting for the detectability of species, we can be more confident that the changes or the drivers and the patterns we're observing are actually occurring and aren't just resulting from variability in how we detect them or how we monitor them. And so the main components of these models, on the left, we've got our detection, non-detection data of our animal of interest. So the pine marten or the squirrels in this instance. I'm going to gather this through repeated surveys of a number of sites. And this could be through point counts, this could be through line transects, you could use camera traps, you could use non-invasive genetic sampling, any survey method that's suitable to your species of interest and allows you to gather presence-absence data each time you survey. And then we've got our site level covariate data. So this is really any factor that might differ between the sites that we sample or differs throughout the landscape that we think might affect the occurrence of our species or our ability to detect them. So this is things like the proportion of broadleaf woodland in an area, or the number of roads, or the density of rivers. And then finally, we've got our occasion level data. So this is factors that might differ between our sampling occasions. So if I'm going to sample a site 10 times in 10 days, then what can differ between those days that might affect how I detect them? So this could be things like the weather, it could be the time of year. If we're using bait, it could be the bait. And so by combining these things within these occupancy models, we're able to model the detection, non-detection of animals as a function of covariates. And this allows us to build models and find out how habitat is driving the occurrence of these species. But what if we're interested in the interactions of animals as well in more than one species? Well, we can extend those standard models I was talking about on the last slide by including an explicit component for how the species are interacting, and we can model those interactions as a function of, for example, the proportion of woodland. And so in our case here of the pine marten, the red squirrel and the grey squirrel, we've got 3 species. And so we've got 8 possible occurrence states, which vary from none of the species occurring at a site to just one of any of them, all the way through to all 3 species co-occurring. And this approach means that we can quantitatively examine how animals are interacting, but also how species occurrence is responding to both those interactions with other animals and environmental factors. And so we've got the hypothesis we want to look at. We've got our modeling framework. Now we needed a really robust data set. And so how are we going to sample for 3 species, some of which can be notoriously difficult to detect? And so myself and the team are really big believers in Occam's razor. The simplest answer is usually right. So we wanted to keep things as simple as possible. And so our surveying was conducted by camera traps. At each site, we stuck out a camera trap deployed adjacent to a baited squirrel feeder. We stuck it at around head height, and we filled that feeder with sunflower seeds and peanuts. And then we just left that feeder for 2 weeks and allowed the camera to remotely monitor it. And so in doing this, we split Northern Ireland up into 1 kilometre square grids. And one of the reasons we kept the method as simple as possible is that we wanted to conduct enough sampling, we want to survey enough sites that it was going to be representative of the entire region and also informative in terms of landscape scale management of these species. And so we did this as a citizen science project. This was that members of the public signed up, underwent training, and then went out and conducted the sampling with us. This enabled us to sample on a scale that was just inconceivable to a single research or institutional research group. And so we repeated this survey 3 times over 5 years, sampling over 700 sites in Northern Ireland. The first survey was completed in 2015, where a team of 70 citizen scientists surveyed over 330 sites. We repeated this again in 2018, where we sampled 173 sites, and then one more time finally in 2020, where we sampled another 207 sites. And so we'd gathered that detection, non-detection data on the pine marten, the red squirrel, and the grey squirrel that we needed. Then we had to select our site covariates. And there's a general saying with occupancy modeling, and the polite version is, if you put rubbish in, you're going to get rubbish out. And all this really means is you have to be really careful in selecting the factors that are biologically relevant to the occurrence or co-occurrence of your species. And so if you just plug in anything, then the outcomes you get are likely to be spurious. And so in light of this, we carefully selected 6 landscape covariates and 2 geographic variables, which you can see here. Again, these were all calculated on a 1 kilometre square scale, which was the scale of our site. And so you'll see here the proportion of broadleaf and mixed woodlands and the proportion of area made up of coniferous woodlands. These are the 2 main covariates we're going to be looking at and thinking about today in terms of how they're affecting these interactions. So let's jump straight into some results. So first of all, what you're looking at here are the general patterns and trends of the 3 species over the 5-year period. And so on the y-axis over here, what you're looking at is the mean probability of occupancy of the 3 species across the entire landscape. And so you've got red squirrels in red, you've got grey squirrels in green, and you've got pine martens in blue. And what you're seeing is that the probability of occurrence of both the pine marten and the red squirrel increased incredibly over the 5-year period. Pine marten occurrence more than doubled within the landscape, and red squirrel occurrence increased by over 1/3. And the opposite was true for the grey squirrel. Their occurrence within the landscape more than halved over just that 5-year period. And so we found these immediate results of that scale and the impact of marten recovery on both squirrels, as seen here, to be really mind-boggling. So what does this look like on a landscape scale if we plot it spatially. So here you're looking at a series of heat maps of Northern Ireland, which are showing the changes in occurrence of the three species over time. So you've got red squirrels on the left, you've got grey squirrels in the middle, and you've got pine marten on the right. The top row is showing you results from 2015. That middle row is showing you predictions and results from 2020. And the bottom row is showing you a percentage difference in occupancy of the species between the first year and the last year of sampling. In those top two rows, the hotter colors, the reds and the oranges, are displaying higher predicted occupancies, and the colder colors are showing lower probabilities of occupancies. While in that bottom row, the green are showing you big percentage increases in occupancy or occurrence, and the reds are showing you declines. And so you can see in these spatially explicit predictions over the 5 years, on the right-hand side here, we're seeing rapid recovery of pine martens, with the species now occurring throughout the region. Although occupancy is remaining its highest in the southwest regions, especially in the large forested areas. Red squirrels have undergone a very similar recovery. And in fact, that while their mean occurrence has increased throughout the landscape, the highest probabilities of occupancy are centered in the exact same locations that pine martens have recovered throughout the southwest and in those large forested areas. Grey squirrels, on the other hand, have undergone severe, significant declines and have gone from being the most widespread of the three species to being the most range restricted. Now, finally, we're looking at what for me is the most exciting and intriguing of the results. So here you're looking at the co-occurrence or the interactions of the species as a function of those two main forest types. So this time we've got broadleaf forests on the left and conifer forests on the right. I want us to start on these top two plots. So what we're looking at here is the probability of red squirrels occurring in an area made up of broadleaf forest, so that as you go along that x-axis, the amount of broadleaf forest in the area is increasing, and it's conditional on the presence or absence of the pine marten, with the presence in blue and the absence in red. And what we see is that pine marten presence in broadleaf forests is significantly increasing the probability of occurrence of red squirrels. Now, if we look over to the conifer forests, we see a slightly different pattern. While in smaller conifer forests, we see that same positive impact of pine martens on red squirrels. We see that once conifer forests are going over around 60% of the kilometre squared, we see the direction and strength of that interaction changes, and the presence of pine marten reduces the probability of occupancy of red squirrels. So in very large uniform commercial plantations, we might expect pine martens, once they reach a certain density, to start lowering the occurrence of red squirrels. Now moving on to these middle plots, we're seeing the impacts of the pine marten, presence or absence, same colors again, present in blue and absent in red, but looking at the occurrence of the red squirrel. And what we see is, irregardless of the habitat type, wherever the pine marten is present, we see suppression of the grey squirrel. So consistent with our hypothesis, no matter what habitat type you're in, when the pine marten recovers, we see significantly lower occurrence of grey squirrels. Now, finally, on this bottom plot, looking at the occurrence of the red squirrel, but conditional on the presence or absence of the grey squirrel, we see a very similar pattern to the plot above, that the grey squirrel is, wherever it's present, reduces the probability of occurrence of the red squirrel, no matter whether that's in broadleaf forest or coniferous plantation. And so a quick summary of those results is we've got pine marten occupancy has more than doubled in a 5-year period in Northern Ireland. During that same period, the occurrence of red squirrels has increased by over 1/3, and grey squirrel occurrence has more than halved. And we can see that habitat modifies the strength and direction of the co-evolved interactions between pine martens and their native prey, the red squirrel, but it does not mediate evolutionary naive interactions, neither between the native predator and the invasive prey, the grey squirrel, or between the invasive prey and its native competitor, the red squirrel. And so if we revisit our ideas, our hypotheses from the beginning, we see that we find support for both hypothesis 1, that the impacts of pine marten on grey squirrels were going to be consistent regardless of habitat, And for our second hypothesis, that the interactions of the pine marten and the red squirrel are dynamic and they're dependent on habitat. And we see it's those natural, more structurally complex habitats where we see the biggest benefits. But we didn't find support for our final hypothesis, that the competitively linked native invasive prey species interactions are also mediated by habitat. And so we didn't find support for the reasoning that underpins the Stronghold management plans. And so what does this mean? Well, the big take-home message here is a really positive one. The restoration and recovery of native predators can provide control of established invasive species on a landscape scale. But those benefits are going to be spatially structured and habitat specific. We see the greatest benefits are found in natural, structurally complex habitats, such as native, broadleaf, and mixed woodlands. And we also see that human modification of habitats can disrupt established co-evolved interactions between native predators and native prey, to the point they reverse the usual interaction pathways. What are the implications of this work? Well, I'd argue that we see that conservation strategies which don't consider the interactions between both the environment and the species are going to be subject to bias, and that this in turn can lead to misguided management. And we see perhaps a need to reconsider red squirrel conservation strategies that are focused solely on Conifer Plantations as Stronghold, given pine marten recovery. And whilst this is a very viable, has been extremely valuable tool in the past and in recent years, perhaps future efforts should look towards increasing proportions of native woodlands alongside human control efforts, as well as within plantations themselves, perhaps focusing on increasing structural complexity, having a diversity of different ages, a mix of species, including both native broadleafs and native conifers. And finally, predator conservation is a key and vital strategy in the face of ongoing biodiversity decline, but it has to be undertaken alongside protection and maintenance of natural, structurally complex habitats. If you'd like to read any more about this work, it's available online in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. You can also email me and I'll happily send you a copy. I just want to say a huge thank you to the UK Squirrel Accord for hosting this and giving me the opportunity to speak to you all, and a final massive thank you to all of you for listening. And I look forward to having discussion and questions later.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Josh, for that important look at the pine marten recovery and the impacts on both red and grey squirrels in different habitats. It's brilliant. Well, thank you. And we'll move to Heinz now, who I think is going to look at the Registral strongholds in Northern England.
Great, thank you, Kay. Right, so yeah, we're going to just have a quick look at the historical picture of the use of the red squirrel strongholds in the landscape in Northern England. Go to the next page. So these 15 reserves or strongholds were established in 2005. If you recall Josh's presentation, he showed a slide where it demonstrated the historical decline of red squirrel range across England, just gradually marching northwards and replacing grey squirrels marching northwards and replacing red squirrel occupancy in the landscape. And at the point in time, there was a concern that that northern march of grey squirrels, something had to be done. And it was decided to establish these 17 reserves and with their 5-kilometre buffer comprised of strongholds, or were named red squirrel strongholds. In Northumberland, you had a list of different reserves: Kyloe, Isiford, Kidland, Harwood, Rayleigh, Kilda, Dipton, Duke's House, Healy, High Kellis, Slaley and Dukesfield. In Cumbria, you had Greystoke, Winfell and Winlatter, Thilmere, and Garsdale and Malastang to the south, southeast of Cumbria. North Yorkshire was Greenfield and Woodale, and in Merseyside it was Sefton. Now, the reason for these, or how they were designated, were based on a number of reasons. So the approach was developed following years of research and leaning on science, and it was felt that red squirrels had to be at the best chance of long-term survival in these particular habitats. Just to point out that they were predominantly conifer forests, and based on the criteria such as current strength of red squirrel populations, the absence of grey squirrels in them, and the isolation of woodlands, and thus reducing the opportunities of grey squirrels to move in and become established there, and the potential of landscape scale conservation effort and collaboration. So those were the reasons why these strongholds were designated back in 2005. This then initiated, or was part of the process, the grant scheme, the English Woodland Grant Scheme, which were then made available to landowners within the strongholds. So the English Woodland Grant Scheme was rather a generous offer in terms of a grant, and enabled woodland owners to get the grant to employ red squirrel rangers or keepers to control grey squirrels. Time moved on, and as we go to the next page, just to give an example of one of these is Kilda red squirrel stronghold, so the circled area in the top there, which is an enormous conifer forest, man-made, planted in the 1930s, 65,000 hectares. Now, only 2/3 of this is forested, mainly with conifer trees and mainly Sitka spruce. So what sort of carrying capacity would a forest like this have in terms of red squirrels? Now, the equation would be 65,000 hectares. Only a third, or 2/3, 0.66 of that would be trees. And then looking at the table at the bottom, which is taken from the Forestry Commission Practice Note 11, you can see in the north of England, Sitka spruce forest has a carrying capacity of maximum up to 0.11 red squirrels per hectare. So put that into the equation, and that gives you almost 5,000 red squirrels. So that's roughly the carrying capacity of Kilda as an estimate, and that is about 16% of England's red squirrel population, the total English red squirrel population being 29,500, that figure coming from the Mammal Society and Natural England's calculations a couple of years ago. Now, this is within a context of a recovering pine marten population, although still very small, and still some research ongoing to determine how the pine marten population is doing in Kilda Forest, but they are there. And looking at how red squirrels are doing in Kilda, in the Kilda Stronghold specifically, this graph represents the occupancy on the left, and at the bottom are the years. So you can see red squirrel occupancies remain stable. It's actually climbed in the last few years, which is good news. Greys have as well, but it's come down between 2019 and 2021. But red squirrels are actually doing pretty well outside of the stronghold as well. And this data we've been able to collate thanks to collaboration with Northern Red Squirrels and all the 32 community red squirrel groups, volunteer groups in the north of England. And this map has been instrumental in expanding the grant scheme to outside of the red squirrel stronghold. So with the advent of the Countryside Stewardship Woodland Improvement Grant, which these days pay a supplement of £50 per hectare for landowners to control grey squirrels, the reach or availability of grant is now to landowners outside of this area. The grant's actually available nationally. It's just that within red squirrel range, you score higher points. The Countryside Stewardship Grant Scheme is a competitive grant, and you score higher points if you're within red squirrel range, and you can therefore stipulate that it's a priority species for your area. So this map we're looking at now is the government's MAGIC website, where red squirrel priority areas are highlighted. So anybody within any landowner or woodland owner in that area will receive a bonus points if they're applying to Countryside Stewardship. And this is just looking at Cumbria, and then further south at Formby. So that's good news. Our data collection and demonstrating that red squirrel range is expanded beyond the strongholds has enabled grants to be opened, or at least bonus points to landowners applying for grants outside of those areas. Now, just to look at our spring monitoring program, what does that tell us about these strongholds? And just as a quick snapshot, the Northern England red squirrel occupancy trend. So when I say occupancy trend, that means we are monitoring, our target is 300 survey sites across the north of England. And of those 300, which proportion or percentage have red squirrels in them, and which proportion has grey squirrels in them. And you can see here that over the last number of years, red squirrel occupancy has remained stable. And that's quite notable and important. Again, referring back to Josh's map that showed grey squirrels just marching northwards. So something's changed in the north of England, and it's we'll come on to why that is. But yeah, we did actually change we intensified our survey last year. We increased instead of 2-week survey, 1 point within a 2-kilometre tetrad, we increased it to 2 survey points over 4 weeks. So we got a more accurate picture. So our historical figure might be a little underestimated, but yeah, nevertheless, red squirrel range and occupancy has gone up, but so has grey squirrels. And yeah, this is just looking at the different strongholds and the breakdown of the proportion of red squirrels and grey squirrels found within them. You can clearly see that the Slaley red squirrel complex, which is near Hexham, has not worked as well. There are reasons for that. Right on the front line of grey squirrels marching north, and very few landowners following the English Woodland grant scheme that went on to the new countryside stewardship scheme, which had a direct impact on that area, not achieving and not improving as the other areas have. But the rest of them are doing relatively well. You can see that North Yorkshire Dales doing very well, and so is the North Lake complex as well. All these charts are available on our website under the monitoring program results if you wanted to have a more detailed look and read. Now, when you look at all the strongholds and you combine the results for these, you start to see that the occupancy of red squirrels within the stronghold, represented here by the red line, is higher than the amber line of red squirrel occupancy outside of the strongholds. So the strongholds are clearly having some sort of positive effect or helping red squirrels. Yes, it's not the best and greatest of habitats, Sitka spruce forest, however, they're not totally impermeable to grey squirrels, but grey squirrels don't tend to thrive in them. They will come into conifer forest, but not at the high density that you will find them in our broadleaf forest. So there's a natural barrier immediately created by that. The grey squirrels like our broadleaf forests because of the bigger seeds like acorns and beech is found in those forests, and they need that nourishment, and they just don't thrive as much as red squirrels within these habitats. Anyway, so the point is that historically you can see that red squirrel occupancy within strongholds is higher. And when we look at the next chart, you can see the opposite is true for grey squirrels. So the light grey line represents grey squirrels within strongholds, whereas the black line shows grey squirrels outside of strongholds. Again, so grey squirrels do better outside of the red squirrel strongholds than inside. However, when we look at red squirrel detection, so this is looking at data from 2020 to 2021 in the northeast of England, the red squirrel reserves is in dark red, and the buffer zone is in a lighter red. And you can see all the points on the map showing red squirrel detection. But here in the southeast of Northumberland, you suddenly find a high density of red sightings, and that's outside of a red squirrel stronghold. So therefore we can say that the stronghold approach is likely not the only and the best solution these days, because things have changed, and what is the solution? Well, that's something still to be debated, but clearly, due to local volunteer community effort, this situation has changed dramatically so, and fantastic for them for doing so, to the local group effort, as well as further north on the map here on the eastern side. So you can see, due to community action, volunteer effort, as well as still doing work within the strongholds, the picture has become more promising for red squirrels overall. And yeah, 85% of the grey squirrel management is due to the local volunteer groups across the north of England. And that's why we're seeing this change, and why we're holding that red line on the occupancy chart. Red squirrel range occupancy is remaining stable due to this tremendous effort. And there you can see the map demonstrating red squirrel range is quite encouraging. This is just a quick snapshot of last year, 2021's grey squirrel management across the north of England. 85% of this is local group effort. So a tremendous effort being invested there to hold back the greys, to allow red squirrels to thrive again. This is just a heat map representing grey squirrel management across the north of England as well. And yeah, so when we look at the different counties, so the map on the right-hand side is our 2021 spring monitoring program results overall. You combine this, so this is not looking specifically at strongholds, but looking at county level. In Cumbria, you can see the occupancies remain stable. It's actually gone up a bit. In Northumberland, slight dip here, 2018-19, but then it's up again. So good news there. And lastly, Lancashire on the top left graph. Lancashire is a much smaller reserve with quite a lot of fluctuation due to grey squirrel incursion and squirrel pox outbreaks, but nevertheless, reds are hanging on there. North Yorkshire, the map in the middle bottom, that's doing really well with a very high occupancy for the area, up to over 70% of reds. So yes, what is the future? Good question. That's something we need to address clearly, where there is action, local action by local volunteer groups and other organizations. It's making a tremendous difference. The strongholds, do they have a role to play in the future? Well, clearly they are at the moment helping. So they're just part of the package and not the silver bullet, an answer to everything, because red squirrels are doing well outside of them as well. Thank you. That's all from me. I'll pass back to Kay.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Heinz, for that overview of red squirrel strongholds and conservation in Northern England. That's brilliant. And now finally, we have Louise. If Louise with us, I will share my screen.
Start on the next slide, please.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Kay. So we've just heard all about the grey squirrels, and that they are obviously a key factor in the decline of red squirrels, partly because of their competition for space and resources. Because the natural habitat of grey squirrels is the broadleaf forest, it's not surprising that in the UK, red squirrel persistence has been highest in the conifer forest that deny the grey squirrels this competitive advantage. So yes, the Conifer Plantations play a critical role in the conservation of red squirrels in Scotland, although we've just heard from the other two presenters kind of a bit more information about that. But in the UK, the red squirrels and their drays, they are protected in the legislation. And so when there's forest operations, their presence needs to be very carefully considered. So Forestry Land Scotland, they manage about 480,000 hectares of Scotland's publicly owned forest. So it's called the National Forest Estate. And they're used for timber production, for recreation, and for wildlife conservation. Now, thinning and felling operations are the most common forest operations that occur. Next slide, please. So together with Nature Scot, Forestry Land Scotland have produced detailed guidance, which kind of outlines the mitigation actions that they need to undertake during forest operations. Now, one of these mitigations is the requirement, for example, to carry out pre-operational dray surveys to identify dray locations with a view to mark to mark the trees and to leave the drays standing. But other examples of mitigation include felling or thinning outside the breeding season, and what they call squirrel-friendly order of felling. So that avoids isolating red squirrels in sort of clumps of trees surrounded by open ground. So you start felling as far away from areas with drays as possible and try to maintain connectivity with adjacent tree crops as long as possible, so that you give escape routes as long as possible to squirrels. So although this guidance is in place, there are still significant knowledge gaps about the impact of forest operations on red squirrels, and also about the effectiveness of pre-operational surveys and the other mitigation measures that are being mentioned in sort of the licenses that foresters get. So next slide, please. So together with Forestry Land Scotland, we designed this research to answer the following research questions. So this research was looking at how effective the pre-operational dray surveys really are. Because although we all knew that when you're standing in sick spruce forest and you're looking up to try and see any drays, this is going to be really complex, but really how that hadn't really been measured in any scientific study. So that was really a key question for us. And then we wanted to look at how ranging behavior and dray use and population density changed it in response to thinning operations. And we also wanted to look at the effect of thinning operations on breeding success and survival. So next slide, please. So during this presentation, I'm only going to talk about a study we carried out a few years back. This was our first field site at Furness in the Highlands of Scotland, which I'm showing on a map here, although I appreciate there was some international audience, so it might be quite zoomed in for some of you, but imagine this sort of high up in north in Scotland. But we are currently, we finished our field work just earlier this year, and we're now doing the analysis for some clear fell sites and some further thinning sites, and I'll touch upon that towards the end of the presentation for a little bit as well. And next slide, please. So for our field work, we used modified Ming traps with these attached shelter boxes that you can see in the slide there. And then what we do is we put a Hessian sack over the back of those traps. We lift the hedge and the squirrel runs in this Hessian trap in the Hessian sack, and it gets transferred in that metal handling cone that you see there. We use that to make sure that the squirrels don't injure themselves, and we can carry out health checks and sex the squirrel, and then we fit these collars on them. And we find that squirrels often get re-trapped, and they seem to have very little negative experience from it, or at least the hazelnuts must outweigh the negative experience. So we did an 8-day trapping period in February to fit the collars, and then at the end of August, September, we did another trapping session and retrieved the collars. And because this was thinning operations, we did it in the same site at the same locations so that we could also assess the density. Next slide, please. So these are some photos of our field work. In February 2017, we put out about 24 traps, and we had 74 trapping events. And we trapped 25 different red squirrels, different individuals, between 1 and 7 times each. In total, we collared 22 squirrels. We had exactly 11 females and 11 males that were of sufficient weight to take these recollars. And we radio tracked the squirrels on a daily basis. So we were getting about 1 to 3 fixes per day per squirrel if we could, until we then did the retrapping in September. And for each location, we would look at whether we could see the squirrel being visually active, or whether we could see a dray, or if we didn't see a squirrel or a dray, it would get recorded as an unknown location. Excuse me. And the thinning operations took place sort of in the middle of our field study at the end of May for about 12 days, from the 11th until the 31st of May. Next slide, please. When we did the retrapping in September, we already knew that 4 of the collared squirrels had died during the study. 1 was predated by a raptor, and we had 2 road accidents, and 1 we found dead in a dray, and we didn't know the cause of the mortality there. In September, we had 92 trapping events, with 33 different individuals between 1 and 10 times each. Some squirrels you would trap in the morning and they would be back in the afternoon. They really liked the bait that we put out for them. So if you are listening to this presentation and thinking, what should I feed my squirrels, then I can highly recommend the ARC wildlife squirrel food with hazelnuts mixed in. So 14 of our colored squirrels were retrapped alive, and 5 of our squirrels, we retrieved the collars, but we didn't know what happened to the squirrels. So they had an unknown fate. And in addition to the squirrels that we had collared back in February, there were 7 new females and 11 new males that had come into the site since the February trapping. Next slide, please. So we looked at the red squirrel survival, and as I mentioned earlier, we had 4 tagged individuals that known to have died, and then we had the 5 tagged squirrels of which we didn't really know what happened to them. But we did have one of the males that was still had their tracking device on, and we trapped him alive with his collar like about 2 kilometers away from the study site. So we knew that they had dispersed quite far. So we're thinking maybe some of the missing males, the ones that lost their collar, they could have also dispersed rather than have died, and that's maybe why we didn't retrap them in September. Of the 2 females we didn't retrap, we don't know what happened, but they are more likely to have died since we didn't retrap them. If it would have been more unlikely that they would have left the study area, especially as it seemed such a good area with good food availability. So our statistical analysis also showed a very high survival rate, no difference between males or female squirrels, and compared to other studies, that survival rates is very high. So for both sexes combined in our study, it was very similar to the annual survivorship of adult red squirrels in Northern England, as well as long-term survival that we found in Belgium for both sexes. And there no forest operations took place on those study sites. So despite the forest operations having taken place, it seemed like on this particular site, at least, there had been limited mortality due to the forest operations. So next slide, please. So another question was to look at how effective the pre-operational DRE surveys were. So let's take a look at the green squares and the red dots are the DREs that were identified during the DRE survey. So somebody went out about 4 weeks before the forest operations took place, was a very experienced surveyor, and they noted all the DREs that they could find. And the gray triangles, those are the DREs that we knew from our radio tracking efforts that these were all DREs in use during our study. Now, I'll save you the count. Next slide, please. During the DRE survey, there were 49 DREs that were recorded across the whole study area. So although the gray triangles, there were 193. So we knew that in real life, if you will, there were 193 DREs that were being used by red squirrels. Now, I know that sounds pretty bad, but we have to remember that the DRE survey was carried out only over a 2-day period in April, so before the forest operations happened. And these gray triangles were recorded over a 9-month period across our own study. So then what we did is we looked at, okay, at the time that the DRE survey took place, how many had we recorded at that time? Now, at that time, we had only recorded 45 out of our 193 DRE locations. Of those 45, only 7 of them were actually identified by the DRE survey, and the rest of the DREs that were recorded weren't actually in use at that time. So even though the DRE survey in April, if we compared that to our data that we had so far in April, still 38 DREs, which came to staggering 85%, had been missed during the survey. And when we took the entire study period into account, 88.6% of the DREs were not identified during the DRE survey. So they were either missed or they were newly built after the DRE survey took place. So our study kind of suggests that the Dray surveys are of quite limited use beyond establishing the presence of red squirrels. And they're actually also less useful to confirm red squirrel absence, as there seem to be drays in the area that aren't actually being used. So surveys, they miss quite a high percentage of drays that we confirmed were actually being used, and the relatively small percentage that they did record had quite a high number of old or unused drays. So that doesn't just reflect difficulty in detecting squirrel drays in a conifer canopy, but also the very flexible nature of red squirrel nesting behavior. So perhaps we don't need to be too precious or trying too hard to protect gray squirrel drays, mainly because we're just not very good at it, at the detection of it anyway. So next slide, please. Because we also then looked at the dray use per squirrel, and we found that red squirrels use an average of nearly 13 different drays throughout the entire study period. And it was also much higher after the forest operations than before the forest operation. So you can see the figures there on the slide. Now, using different drays can have a number of advantages or reasons. So home range may be given to offspring with a shift in adult range, or it could be to minimize parasite loads, or because of changes in food supply. So all that does tie in a little bit with the timing of the forest operations, being just in the middle of, well, after the first weaning period, in the middle of the breeding season, as well as the weather getting warmer, which could increase parasite load. So it's a little bit hard to say the reasoning for it, but drays are also abandoned due to disturbance. So that observed increase to 7.5 drays used per squirrel on average does suggest that disturbance could cause to an adjustment in space use and thereby dray use. But certainly what the study shows, which is kind of the positive side of it, is that they are very flexible in the use of drays, and it seems that building new drays and using new drays, it's a very flexible behavior. Next slide, please. So we also looked at the breeding activity and population density. In terms of breeding activity, we found, we just checked the sexual activity of the squirrels during the trappings sessions that we had, and we found evidence of breeding both in our females that we had collared as well as the newly trapped females. So 7 out of the 9 retrapped females, so the ones that we trapped in the first trapping rounds, they were lactating or they just finished lactating. And of the new adult females, 2 of them were lactating as well. So again, forest operations certainly didn't seem to stop the breeding success later, I should say breeding activity later in the year. In terms of population density, that was actually higher after the forest operations compared to before the forest operations. And they compare again to high density, reported high densities from Scottish pine woods, and they're actually much higher of more typical densities for these sort of mixed spruce pine conifer habitats in average seed years. So yes, the forest operations certainly didn't have a negative impact on population density. Next slide, please. And then finally, we looked at the ranging behaviors of the squirrel. So we didn't find any differences in home range area or core area between males and females. And when we looked at when we pulled all the squirrels together, the size of the home range area or their core area was also not significantly different before or after forest operations. Now that doesn't necessarily tell us something about the potential displacement, because you can obviously have the same area size, but at a different location. So that's why we also looked at home range overlap. So if the home range is roughly in the same location before and after forest operations, then the overlap would be 100%, whereas if an animal would be completely displaced, so it had to relocate, then there would be a 0% overlap. So we found quite high percentages of overlap for the home range in its entirety in 76%, and for the core area overlap we were looking at 67%. So again, that suggests that squirrels remained largely within their pre-thinning home range. Now, the analysis did suggest that 4 individuals, we found they really explored new areas after forest operations, and they increased their home range size and core area size significantly. So there was still high overlap, but we could see that after forest operations, they increased their sizes. Now, that could be a response to local home range quality as a result of the thinning, but it can also be individual responses to changes in food availability. So we had one female, for example, when we looked at her ranging behavior in more detail, you could very clearly see she started to range towards a new area around the river where there were lots of hazel trees and producing hazelnuts, which would explain why she increased her home range, and that had really nothing to do with the forest operations. So next slide, please. And then that was just some conclusions. So the next slide again, please. Sorry about that. So we found that the dray use seemed very flexible and dynamic. The dray survey seemed to be of limited use beyond establishing the presence of red squirrels. We found no negative impact of the thinning operations on red squirrel survival, and equally was true for overall red squirrel density. No significant difference when we compared the home range size before and after forest operations, suggesting that the thinning at our study site didn't affect overall space use, and the breeding activity continued during and after forest operations. So the take-home message of the research is really quite positive in that the forest thinning operations, which are essential to forest industry and forest and timber production, they seem to be compatible with red squirrel conservation at this particular study site. Now we are very aware that that the study site this was only the one site that we looked at. So after we worked on this site, we've been working on a number of further study sites where there was thinning and clear fell taking place. So next slide, please. So the results of this is we published later this year, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit about it. So these are sort of preliminary results, not done any statistical analysis on it yet, but what we found is that with the clear fell sites, it was really interesting. What we wanted to do was look at sites that had different levels of isolation. So whether they were almost standalone, and if they were be clear felled, that would force the squirrels to go out over or across an open area to reach nearby forests, and other clear fell sites were adjacent to other forest blocks. And what we found with when it was adjacent to other forest blocks, that they did some exploratory trips into new areas while the clear fell was taking place, but the squirrels really clung on to the last trees before making the final move into these new areas. We wanted to look also at what impact that would have on surrounding squirrels, but what we actually found was that the area that they moved into, it seemed quite suboptimal habitat because it wasn't a habitat where we had trapped squirrels at the start of the study. So that was quite interesting to see their behavior of really staying in that old clear fell site for until basically the last day, until the last trees got felled, and that really supports the squirrel friendly felling approach. When we looked at another site where it was very isolated, we found that the squirrels already voluntarily dispersed into new areas across large open areas without the forest operations even having taken place. So that was quite interesting as well, and all the squirrels that we tracked had actually survived sort of moving into these new areas. So this research is being carried out until the end of this year, and based on the research, Forestry Land Scotland will look at whether they can improve their forestry guidance on forest operations and red squirrel in Scottish forests. And final slide, please. I just wanted to thank the research team, because it certainly wouldn't have been possible without the immense efforts of my field assistants and volunteers, and I'm very grateful for their efforts in helping me with the data collection. And that was the end of my presentation. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Louise. I'm sure we're all interested to see the final results when they come out. It'll be brilliant. Great. Oh, I've still got this going. Sorry, I'm trying to get back now. So we've had some questions sent in, and I know Josh has been busy answering some other ones on the Q&A. So we'll start off with one for Louise. What legal protection did red squirrels and pine martens have in Scotland, and is their habitat protected? I know you mentioned.
Yeah, so for red squirrels, they are protected. Their individuals are protected, and their drays are protected. Their habitat are protected in so far that if you want to do anything that might cause disturbance to the squirrels or to their drays, or might prevent them from accessing their drays, then you need to apply for a license. So any forest operations that would take place are required to have a license in place. Pine martens are, I believe, a European protected species. And Josh, you can fill me in here. And they are also protected. So although there have been some translocations, they are no longer, it's not legal to control pine martens as such. We do have a lot of discussions around these parts of Scotland about that, because they do have a very negative impact, for example, on capercaillie breeding as well. So there are discussions about whether there could be translocations, or whether if predators get to certain protected areas, or if they have a big impact and actually the populations are fine, whether control could be a possibility. But those discussions are ongoing.
Thanks, Louise. Josh, did you want to say anything more on that one?
Could I just jump on the end of there, which I think is an extremely salient point about any sort of predator recovery, that huge facets of it are about public perceptions and conflicts with humans and how we mitigate those. And so what I might bang on a drum that is the recovery of predators is great for ecosystems. Really, we need the recovery of predators to be tolerable and acceptable to the people who share those landscapes with them. And Louise raises the fantastic point of capercaillie and conflicts going on there. I know there's some fantastic work being done by Xavier Lambin and his PhD, or now graduate postdoc Christian Navarro and Jack Bamber, on diversionary feeding and different ways we could try and mitigate the pressures of pine marten on protected species or threatened species, as well as different conflicts with humans.
Thanks, Josh. There was a question about, do reds alter their behaviour when pine martens move in?
I guess I could take this one.
Yeah.
So when they move in, it's hard to say, but yes. So we did a study back in 2015, published a few years ago, where we looked at the responses of both red squirrels and grey squirrels to pine marten scent. So we basically had feeding stations with camera traps sort of placed opposite. We recorded those feeding stations, and we applied pine marten scent in the form of scats mixed in water and recorded the behaviours. In the red squirrels, we saw basically a complete drop in the visitation rate. So they stopped visiting for about 48 hours. And when they did visit, they basically became really, really vigilant, and they feeded a lot less. And so we have those, what you think of as stereotypical symptoms or properties of a landscape of fear, although I don't really like that term. What we see is anti-predator behaviours. So red squirrels are aware of the threat of pine martens and will avoid places where there's obvious cues for them. Grey squirrels, on the other hand, didn't show any such responses.
That's great, thank you very much. Will pine marten reintroduction have any impact on urban grey squirrel populations? And there was a paper on this as well, wasn't there?
There is, yeah. And so it actually comes from the first, today I talked about the sampling we did in 2015. And as part of that, we did some single species versions of the models I displayed today. And the question is, we don't know. So our predictions there were not. So in those initial models, what we saw was pine martens were really strongly avoiding urban areas. And it looked like pine martens were really only going to stay in forested areas. But as sampling went on, we carried on sampling over time, what we've seen is that might actually just be a symptom of the stage of recovery that they're at. That pine martens are, first of all, filling in optimal habitats, so they're expanding and recovering in forests. But once these reach carrying capacity, we might see them occurring in other areas. So for example, in that last year of sampling, we had pine martens on the outskirts of Belfast. I had earlier that year kits in an attic in the city centre of Belfast. Now, the real question is, will they reach a sufficient density to provide control of greys in urban areas? I don't have any data or evidence to say that. I'd suspect not. And to me, this is where the massive, massive importance of value of human effort comes in. We're never, ever going to be able to deal with grey squirrels with pine martens alone if we've still got source populations in cities and urban areas. And so you can never underestimate the importance and the value of the human-led control efforts, especially if they can be targeted and used alongside natural control methods.
Yeah, the volunteers and community groups make such a valuable contribution to red squirrel conservation. It's really important. Do any of the speakers have any insights about whether the recent storms affected red squirrel numbers? I'll come to Heinz first, because I know I've seen pictures of quite a considerable amount of damage in some of the northern forests.
Yeah, I think the impact will be more likely to be localized. Yes, especially in the northeast of England and obviously in Scotland as well, where there is really bad devastation in some of the forests. At a population level, I don't think the impact will be that worrisome, but at a local scale, yes, there will be obviously red squirrels that will be displaced and needing to move on. We had, for example, an email from a resident within one of the big forests of Northumberland saying, "Oh, what's happened to my squirrels? The storms arrived and can't see them yet." But later on, a few weeks down the line, they came back again to the feeders. So I think, and when you look at the hectarage affected by the storm and flattened and removed by the storm, compare that to the total forest hectarage, the impact is proportionately small, although I don't want to belittle the impact, the devastation that there was.
Thanks very much, Heinz. Louise, can you just expand on this squirrel-friendly felling approach that you mentioned?
Yes, of course. I just wanted to say I saw a question about and I clicked on answer live and then I stopped it, and I think that had made the question disappear, or perhaps it's now unanswered questions, even though I didn't actually answer it. But it was about whether red squirrels are protected in Wales, and I just wanted to say that it's UK-wide legislation, so yes, they are protected in Wales.
Thanks.
As to squirrel-friendly felling, yes. So basically, what they do is when they make a felling plan, and when they apply for when they look at the felling license, and if it's applying for a separate felling license, then they look at where there's connectivity with adjacent woodlands. Often when forests are being felled, there's blocks within a wider forest that are getting felled, or there might be areas where they are closer to adjacent forest blocks. So the idea behind the squirrel-friendly felling is to start in a corner that isn't necessarily easiest for the forest harvesting machine, but that is then the best for the squirrel, so that they're almost driven towards an area where they can either move into adjacent forest, or where the open area to cross into other adjacent forest is sort of the smallest area possible. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Louise. Back to pine martens. So what is the role of complex multi-purpose mixed species plantations for red squirrel and pine marten habitat?
What was the question again, sorry?
What is the role of complex multi-purpose mixed species plantations for red squirrel and pine marten habitat? I think you've answered some of this.
Yeah, so my answer to that would be the outputs of our modelling and the talk really are that the purpose of those is to be able to allow coexistence of both of these species on a large scale, with the hopes that you have pine martens at sufficient densities to provide control of grey squirrels, but you'll also have an abundance of alternate resources. You'll have abundance of refuges created by these structurally complex habitats that are allowing you to have both native predators and native prey coexisting in the sort of equilibrium, non-equilibrium you typically expect.
Thank you. And how do we counteract myths about pine marten and impacts on farm animals?
Very good question. It's been something that we've worked on for a long time in Ireland, is trying to conduct social surveys and get knowledge of awareness and knowledge and perceptions of pine martens and other predators. I don't necessarily think they're all myths. So obviously there's some that are a little far-fetched of pine martens dragging away sheep, but I also don't think we should undermine the valuable experiences of landowners and farmers in these situations. If you've got chickens or you're keeping bees and these are being constantly raided by pine martens, this not only has personal but economic impacts. So I think rather than viewing them as myths that need to be gotten rid of, we should be trying to work with these people who are sharing their landscapes with predators to how we can either lower conflict or mitigate the costs and expenses of living alongside these predators.
Thanks, Josh. Alan Bates asks, do the same restrictions apply to felling on private land where red squirrels live? I think it's one for you, Louise.
Yes, it does.
That was easy. Thank you. There is one for Heinz. Might the relative success of the strongholds actually be due more to habitat suitability for reds than active grey control? And have decision makers considered the effect that the lack of stronghold status has had on volunteers' efforts in the areas beyond the stronghold's boundaries? And might a widened and suitably incentivised stronghold across the north of England achieve greater red habitat, more intensive grey control and greater motivation to community groups? That's from Bob Cartwright.
Thanks, Bob.
Just a small question. Thanks.
That's a long question. Yeah, like I said in my talk, that those strongholds that we currently inherited from 2005, are they still relevant? Yeah, it's a good question. I do think we've, as a community of conservationists and the local volunteer groups, including that, we've demonstrated that it's possible for reds to exist and thrive across the landscape. But yes, clearly we're still facing a tremendous problem with grey squirrels continuing to breed, continuing to come in, and you know, we're going to have to continue to battle that until the fertility control product has been finished, developed, and deployed to help us in that. Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer. I don't think I have the answer to that. The strongholds are still playing a role because of the makeup of them, that they are remote, that they are conifers, that they, to a degree, impermeable to greys, so they don't thrive in there, so they don't occur at high densities, and so therefore squirrel pox is not a problem. But go outside of those strongholds, you've still got quite diverse mixed landscapes where you've got broadleaf forests where greys are thriving and need to be managed and are a risk. But yes, it's something we have discussed in various working groups. How do we go forward? I don't think it's that we're going to stick with the stronghold approach, but it's going to look at a much wider landscape. And this is, I think, one of the things we've mentioned in the development of the Registral action plan for England, that we need to look at and understand and decide how do we take this forward. So at the moment, I don't have an answer, but clearly we've recognized that it's not just about the strongholds. Yes, they do have a role to play, but we need to, maybe similar to Scotland, where they have created red squirrel priority areas in the south of Scotland, where there's a synchronization of habitat, willingness and availability of people to control greys, and etc., where a difference can be made. So maybe, for example, in the future, we might have a stronghold in the southeast of Northumberland on the coast. I did notice that somebody in one of the questions mentioned that is it because of a higher density of humans there that we have higher occurrence of reporting red squirrels? Yes, that is part of the reason, but there's still, red squirrels are doing well there, they're thriving. So that might be an area identified, the east coast of Northumberland as well. That could be a priority area for red squirrel conservation, or a park, as the Scottish project have called them. Hopefully that helps answer the question, not completely.
Thanks, Heinz. And you touched on squirrel pox, and somebody just asked, has any red squirrel population shown to be effectively immune to the virus?
No.
No.
I know there was a report published from Sefton a few years ago that suggested that might be the case, but after reading the report, I wasn't convinced. I think it's too early to say. I've not seen any evidence to suggest that it might be possible, yes, but I've not seen conclusive evidence that that is going to happen. So we still have squirrel pox outbreaks and red squirrel populations now occurring every year, here and there. There's a protocol to respond to those when they happen, to minimize and mitigate the results of the impact of them. But yeah, I don't think that we're there yet.
No.
Yeah,
I think usually if there's an outbreak, it does wipe out a significant proportion of the population, often, doesn't it?
It is definitely mitigated by an appropriate response, by whipping out all the feeders and deploying management for grey squirrels. Then things ease down and the reds are protected that way.
Thanks, Heinz. Is there an additional factor that need to be considered, such as vole and mice populations that naturally fluctuate, that also have pine marten food availability?
Yeah, it's a question that has come up ever since we have done this work and we've applied it more generally, and it's a very important one. So voles especially, so the presence of voles in Britain and their absence in Ireland, and how does that affect the patterns we're seeing? And so voles are really important because they're what we think of as a dominant alternate prey. So they undergo pronounced interannual cycles in their population dynamics, where they go from huge booms, where they're the most abundant prey item around, and almost all your generalist predators will feed almost ubiquitously and fully on voles, to crashes where they're basically absent, and that's when your generalist predators can be feeding on other things. And so the way I think about this question is I apply, there's Andy White and his PhD student Andrew Slade at Heriot Watt are two mathematical modelers, and they've done some really fantastic work on the impacts of what we call temporal refuges. So refuges in time caused by peaks in the vole population dynamics on grey squirrels. And the question was, are the patterns we're seeing on grey squirrels in Ireland also what we're going to see with grey squirrels in Scotland, even though voles are present? And the answer was yes, they're just going to be slightly more delayed and less susceptible to stochastic factors that might wipe out populations in Ireland. And so now, while the answer is I don't know, there's no empirical evidence about how applicable our results are and what the impacts of voles are going to be, is the theory suggests that the impacts are probably going to be similar. They might just be lessened, and especially in those peaks in the interannual cycle of the voles. But certainly things to consider, and things we need more investigations to examine and try and gather actual evidence on, to go beyond the theoretical models we have at the moment.
Thanks, Josh. And we've got a couple more about kind of pine marten population dynamics. If an area becomes overpopulated with pine martens, do they drive away the new generation? And if you see two pine martens together at the end of February, is it likely to be a mother with one of last year's young rather than living alongside each other, I suppose?
Okay, so the first one first, which is pine martens are historically, David Balharry called them being limited by social inflexibility. So pine martens hold down territories, and they'll exclude members of the same sex and allowing themselves to overlap with members of the opposite sex. So their carrying capacity is really limited by conspecifics, other pine martens. Now you can get higher numbers in higher quality habitats, there's more resources and you can have smaller home ranges, but certainly once an area reaches its carrying capacity, so the maximum number of martens that could live there, the dominant marten will chase out others. And this leads directly onto the second question, which is one I find absolutely fascinating. So the presiding knowledge would be, yes, if you see two animals together at most times of year, you're probably going to be seeing a kit with its mother. But during my years tracking and radio collaring and following around martens all over the place, we came across all sorts of observations that you wouldn't expect. So we had martens denning with their mothers, we had martens denning with their fathers. This is once they were grown up, they'd dispersed, they'd then come back and share dens with their father or mother. They'd go on foraging trips together. We were catching fully grown adult males in the same single-use trap as their fully grown fathers. All sorts of weird observations of animals, social behaviors in what are solitary animals. And so my answer would be, there's probably more social complexity there than we envisage. And I think this applies to a lot of species. You'd usually be a safe bet saying that's going to be a mother with a kit, but is it certain? Definitely not.
Thanks, Josh. And there's one about how will pine martens impact red squirrels in this Kilda stronghold? You're up in that area, Heinz.
Well, I was just having a chat with Josh before our meeting today, just exactly about that. And yeah, so I know of a particular pine marten population, although very small, in a particular valley within Kilda Forest, which we've been monitoring for squirrels for a long time. And then one day pine martens popped up, and we now know that there are at least 2 or 3 pine martens that have been on cameras, so they're slowly expanding. Yet the red squirrels there are doing well, and yeah, so we based on the research that Josh mentioned and MSG's research, it seems that anecdotally at this stage in Kilda and that particular valley, that pine martens could be having a positive impact. It's the early days, and much research is still planned to observe those pine martens and see how they progress, and obviously how the reds are doing around them, and also the greys, obviously. So we'll see.
And are there any plans to reintroduce pine martens into Cumbria?
Good question. I do not know. I couldn't answer that, and I'm someone who always errs on the side of caution when it comes to reintroductions of animals, especially predators that could return naturally. So can't comment. That's not a yes or a no. Yeah.
Yes, Heinz.
There is the project Boom back on our map, run by the University of Cumbria, where they are at present doing a feasibility study about the reintroduction of pine martens. That's not to say they are going to, they're doing a feasibility study. So they have done local consultations, spoken to local landowners, keepers, farmers, residents. So it's not sort of decided yet. The feedback I've had from public consultations via Project Boom, I've heard that it's been quite positive. So I can't say yes or no about a definite reintroduction. All I can say is there's a feasibility study in progress at the moment, and so far it's progressing well. But there aren't any pine martens there at present, as far as they've been able to determine.
That's great. Thanks very much. Got one. If a pine marten predates a grey squirrel, could it contaminate a feeder with squirrel pox and infect a red squirrel? So can pine martens transmit squirrel pox?
Such a fantastic question, and something we've been pondering ourselves for quite a while now. So there are currently 200-ish hare and tick samples at AFA with Dave Everest awaiting for viral assays on squirrel pox virus and adenovirus. We don't know if they're a viable vector of the pathogen, but perhaps potentially yes. What the timeframes would have to be for this sort of thing, I don't know, but presumably if it's transmitted in the way we think it is with squirrels, and a marten was carrying it and they shared a feeder with a squirrel, then yes. But that's very uncertain. We don't even know if they can carry it yet. But if there's any of these in the future, I'll happily share that information once we have it.
That'd be great, yeah. Have studies been done to establish how successful reds are in broadleaf forest versus conifer plantations without the presence of greys or pine marten? And Jeff Davitt wonders if they are perceived to be doing better in conifer, but that's only because the greys have taken over their preferred habitat.
Heinz, do you want to take this, or do you want me to?
Yes. The answer is yes, but Josh, you go ahead. I can chip in.
So my answer was also going to be yes. So you can just look in mainland Europe, where red squirrels reach density sometimes even a magnitude higher than they ever can in coniferous forests. Broadleaf forests, particularly beech and oak, are probably the most suitable habitat for grey squirrels in the absence of grey squirrels. It's just because of grey squirrels and how we've had to mitigate and manage their impacts that the conifer plantations have seemingly become far more suitable.
And just to add to that, the table that I made reference to in my talk about the carrying capacity of different types of woodland, on there was broadleaf, Southern England, oak and hazel, and the carrying capacity of red squirrels in that would, in theory, be between 2.5 and 18 red squirrels. So yes, that sort of habitat would be ideal for red squirrels, and they'll thrive. But it's the grey squirrel problem again, that they are pushed out of those habitats through competition and disease. Greys just breed so fast when they're in our native broadleaf woodlands. They have the enzymes in their stomach to extract up to 60% higher energy nutrient value out of the food in comparison to our reds. So they just breed like crazy and push out the reds. Plus then the disease, squirrel pox, which increases that replacement.
Thanks very much, Heinz. Not going to mention the council, but is there any way of getting councils to get to do grey squirrel management, as it's one of the biggest problems that groups find, that they can't work with some of the local landowners?
I think it's finding the right person in the council to speak to. There have been volunteer groups out there who have had great success. For example, the Cramlington group in the southeast of Northumberland. That's the area I showed on the map where there was a high density of red sightings. They're just doing a fantastic job there, and they just, I think, got the right person in the council who was on side, understood the ecology and the impact of greys on the woodlands, and managed to collaborate. And the result is you've got pest species being managed for free in the council woodlands who damage trees and impact our biodiversity and cause localized extinction of red squirrels. So I think it's just, don't give up, get hold of the right person, if need be, write to your local MP of whatever it takes to get them on side, and look at government policy, where government is very much behind supporting the management of grey squirrels in the country because of their impact. The European Squirrel Initiative commissioned a study which demonstrated that on commercial forests, the impact is £37 million a year. And then on top of that, there was, I can't remember, but a few million, 4 million of damage to property. Just don't give up, get hold of the right person, quote government policy, the tree action plan, etc. Contact us and we'll send you some text to borrow, and just keep going.
Get in touch with Heinz.
Not everybody all at once.
Yeah. Could nocturnal pine martens threaten diurnal red squirrels in their drays?
Yeah, so great question. And it's actually, so we've done some big dietary studies into pine martens, as you might expect. So we collected around 1,000 scats across Northern Ireland. And what we actually found was really fascinating. So both red and grey squirrels were only being predated in spring and summer, which is aligned with the breeding seasons quite broadly of the squirrels. And so what we inferred from that is actually most predation is likely happening in the drays when young are available. So whether it's red squirrels or grey squirrels, most of the predation is probably occurring. And this aligns with everything we know about pine martens. If you think about their morphology, how they're evolved, they're not evolved for direct pursuit. They're not evolved for chases. And you often see these videos online of a pine marten going up a tree and a red squirrel running circles around it. And it's because pine martens are evolved to access subnevian and arboreal refuges of small prey. So that the whole way they're evolved to hunt is going into drays, nests, holes, burrows. So yes, certainly, if a pine marten was going to eat a squirrel of either kind, it's most likely to happen in a dray.
Thanks, Josh. And how do you know how much pine martens predate on reds when greys are not present? Does this again go back to the food sources, I guess?
So it's actually much harder to find out. So it's quite easy to find out how much pine martens are predating reds when greys aren't present, and quite easy to find out how much pine martens are predating greys. What's much harder is when they're on their own. What's much harder is to try and find out how much pine martens predate on either when they're all together, because that's usually a really ephemeral and rare situation. So for red squirrels on their own, so where you've got red squirrel only populations with pine martens present, you're talking about a mean 5% occurrence in the diet of the pine marten. While if you've got a grey squirrel population on its own, you're talking about a mean 7, well, it varies depending where you are, but the values go from about a mean 12% in the Irish Midlands up to around 17% in Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
Josh,
yes, sorry.
Is it fair to say that our red squirrels have coexisted with pine martens and therefore they adapt to living with them, whereas grey squirrels in America, the American pine marten territory doesn't overlap with the grey squirrel, so they're a bit stupid and easy prey?
You're 100% right, Heinz. And indeed, it is what for us underpins all the impacts we're seeing is that evolutionary history of the pine marten with the red squirrel, the fact they've existed in the same landscapes and the same habitats together for millennia. They're evolved together, they're co-evolved to share these habitats. Well, grey squirrels haven't. In fact, there's an American marten, but it's significantly smaller than the grey squirrel. And as you say, their range is relatively restricted. They do co-occur where I am here in New York State, but not in many places. But I think it's not only that evolutionary history and the behavioral responses, but you think about the physiological restrictions. So if you're a red squirrel and your zygomatic arch with your head width and your body mass is half the size of a grey squirrel's, well, you can fit into all sorts of cavities and refuges that a red squirrel can't, that you're going to be safe from a pine marten from. So not only do you have these behavioral advantages, that you're aware of the pine marten, you can move out of areas they're using, you can avoid where they're really active, but you've also got access to true refuges. You've got access to cavities that pine marten can't access, and you've got access to drays that are on such thin branches that a pine marten couldn't get to, that aren't accessible to the grey squirrel. So I think that there's lots of reasons that all come back to that very good point you made about the evolutionary history of these two animals that underpin the different impacts of the martens on the greys and martens on the reds.
Great, thanks very much, Josh. I know, Louise, you touched on this, but feeding red squirrels, what is best to feed them if you're going to give supplementary feeding?
Well, I can only talk about the sort of bait that we used, and that was just a squirrel food mixture that they provide. But they do like their hazelnuts, so I would certainly include some hazelnuts if you really want to attract squirrels from far, far away. We have found with our home range studies and our tracking studies that if you provide hazelnuts, they will come from miles away rather than just from the next door neighbors.
Thanks very much. And is there advice around feeding them when greys are present? So not necessarily feeding reds when greys are present, Heinz?
If greys do visit the same feeder, you need to address the problem. You can't just leave it and let them happily feed together. There's the disease risk. So you do have to do something. If you can't, then just stop feeding, disinfect your feeders, take it down, wash out the feeder, and just wait a couple of days, a few days, and then try again. But if the grey comes back, the best advice is to not feed when there are both species. In an ideal scenario, you need to deal with that grey squirrel that's visiting. It needs to be managed, in other words, removed from the scene so that it doesn't pose a risk to the reds.
Thanks, Heinz. In the Irish studies, was the decline in greys due to pine marten predation or dispersal into other areas?
Hi there. Interesting question. Not one I've had before. Almost certainly actual declines. This would be if we'd just done a local study. So if we'd done a work like Emma's, which was really intense in 3 sites, then it'd be very hard to say whether it was actual declines, it was mortality or dispersal, because they have the same effect on a local scale. But because we did this, we did our work and our models were based on a landscape scale. If they were dispersing, you wouldn't see declines in landscape scale occurrence. I mean, your mean occurrence would stay the same because your numbers of squirrels wouldn't be changing. So the declines we're seeing in the landscape are actual declines, not perceived declines at certain sites.
Thanks very much, Josh. From Jeff again, does it follow that efforts should now be made to plant oak and hazel in red squirrel strongholds in Scotland to increase their density? So they've traditionally been conifer plantations, I guess, haven't they? Most of the strongholds that have been allocated.
So is this a question specifically to Scotland? Or?
Well, you can open it up to strongholds generally.
I mean, it's a really good question. I'm sort of personally in favor of the moratorium on oak and hazel, etc., to be removed. I'll unashamedly say that because it's our native trees and forests and we do need them. I do believe that in time, and not very long time, because of the fertility control research, we're going to have a really powerful tool to address the grey problem in the future. Yes, we're still going to need to manage grey squirrels and we need to continue to do so, and we are doing so. But yeah, it's time to start asking the questions, and I am, for us to look at planting oaks and hazels. They are native trees, they're a valuable food source. A hazel tree will start producing seeds very quickly, hazelnuts very quickly. In a few years, but oaks will take decades before they mature and start producing acorns. So we really need to start thinking about that now. As long as there's a management strategy for greys and we've got the fertility control on production line, it's coming our way very soon, I think we'll be all right. But this question needs to be answered by the statutory organizations, which needs to give the yes decision, and I think we should continue to push for that yes.
Thanks, Heinz. Talking about the fertility control, somebody asked if they can have an early introduction of the contraceptive in areas where there are no red squirrels. I mean, the work on the oral contraceptive, we're currently in the 4th of the 5-year project, which will finish in January 2024. But nothing will be made available before that, and it's not dependent on whether it's a red squirrel area or a grey squirrel area. It is dependent on us actually creating an oral contraceptive that's effective and that we can then get registered, and then we'll be more widely available. We've got an update in May, so keep an eye on our events page for that. Just a last couple of questions. Do you think that the discovery of pine martens in the New Forest was deliberate or a relic population?
So I've got actually some secret insights into this. So if you go back a little while ago, Johnny Burks from the VWT published a report on this, and the New Forest Wildlife Centre has held pine martens for a while, and there has been 2 reported escapes from there. So whether the founder population is based on those 2 animals, probably quite unlikely, but certainly there's been some animals released from the Wildlife Centre at some point in time. And so there's a known population there that's been there for at least a decade, if not more. Perhaps it's been remnant the whole time and has persisted. Hard to say whether it's entirely from releases or there was remnants that they supplemented to, but certainly likely a combination of both.
Thanks very much. And are there laws to follow when reintroducing pine martens into the wild?
Yeah, lots and lots and lots. So pine martens are Schedule 5 species under the Wildlife and Country Act. It means they're protected from basically everything. You can't trap them, you can't own them, you can't control them. They've got the highest level of protection of animals in the UK because they're so rare. In terms of translocations, again, people often translocations can be used for many purposes. Now, conservation translocations are extremely important and a really valuable tool within conservation, but they need to be conducted with the correct oversight. And so the IUCN, the International Union Conservation Committee, have since 2013 have international guidelines that should be followed by everybody doing it or undertaking translocations. But yes, there's lots of rules and regulations, but also optional guidelines that should really be followed for anybody considering pushing for or thinking about translocations or reintroductions of any animal, not just pine martens.
Heinz.
Question for Josh. A loaded question, but in your experience and knowledge, how long will it take pine martens reintroduced in a given area to achieve the necessary density to have a positive impact on reds and negative impact on grains? How long does it take?
So I'm going to defer to my dear colleagues and friends, Andrew Slade and Andy White again, who we're currently working on answering exactly this question. So although I said I err on the side of caution when it comes to reintroductions, I do sit on the advisory committee of pine marten reintroduction in North Wales, and we've undertaken large-scale modelling efforts to try and predict this. The positive benefits, so it takes about from a release of, I don't want to give specific numbers, but a release of, let's say, around 20 or more animals. I plucked that out of the sky, don't quote me. You're talking about 20 years until you've got a sufficient population that you even see dispersal out from those local sites. And then beyond that, you're probably talking another decade or a few more before you start seeing those impacts. But the really cool thing that we saw was from the populations that have already been reintroduced into Wales and the small number of animals into North Wales, so the VWT-led ones, the 50 animals there, and the small numbers that have been in North Wales, the models are predicting far reduced impacts of grey squirrels and maintenance of red squirrel populations, which otherwise would not happen. So you're always talking on the scale of decades when it comes to slow-lived animals like pine martens that are having 1 to 2 kits a year. It's not an immediate answer, and it's one of the dangers, I think, of releasing pine martens for the purpose of grey squirrel control is they're not robots. You're not going to release them and say, okay, pine marten, stay here and all the grey squirrels. You release an animal, it's a wild animal, you don't know where it's going to go. And even if it does stay in that exact area, for it to reach the population densities you need to see the impacts, it's a matter of time. And it might not always, it's always going to be a bit more stochastic than we might like, a little bit more random.
Thanks very much, Josh. Someone owns a woodland in West Wales and wonders what the possibility of introducing red squirrels there. And there have been some reintroduction work and reinforcement of red squirrels in Wales. And I think the best people to ask would be Red Squirrels Trust Wales for that answer, to be honest. Do the speakers have any questions for any of the other speakers?
Just to comment, I think pine martens, my understanding is they're quite dependent on having the right habitat. So, you know, a forest, the conifer forest is not an ideal habitat. And Josh, please feel free to add to that. But I believe the reason people install den boxes in for conifer forests is to facilitate pine marten expansion and breeding, because there isn't that cavity in the old oak tree for them to breed in, and therefore they need a lot of help even to get started.
And so I think there's a few things there. So I think firstly, there's been long held views of pine martens as habitat specialists, only to be found in remote forests, only found in old growth forests, and avoiding conifer plantations. So our recent work in Ireland has, both through genetic work and dispersal of genes, so you'd expect there to be certain patterns in the genetic structure of pine martens throughout Ireland, but they don't. It's one homogeneous population, which suggests there's high levels of dispersal. But also from our tracking work, so in coniferous plantations, Heinz is completely right. You're lacking all these above ground cavities that they need to den and that they need to reproduce in. But it doesn't mean they don't live there. All it means is they make massive use of the non-forested habitats. So rather than living in the forest and living at the tops of trees, they're going out into heathland, they're going out into moorland, they're denning in caves, they're denning in badger sets, they're denning wherever, they're in brick walls, in people's attics, wherever they can find somewhere safe to sleep. And it's one of the things I found interesting currently. There was a story a few weeks ago in The Guardian about using den boxes to bolster numbers of pine martens in certain areas to act as bouncers for grey squirrels. And so we ran a den box project in a cross-border project in Ireland with over 50 den boxes. And we, in coniferous plantations, we believe the number of den sites probably does limit them, makes them more susceptible to predation by foxes, especially the kits and the females. But there's no evidence that actually demonstrates yet that putting up den boxes increases your number of pine martens. And this is a big missing step that would be great to be conducted for someone to experimentally demonstrate this. So while logically it makes sense, does it actually happen? Who knows?
Thank you. Was there anything else any of you wanted to say?
I had a question for Louise. Your density estimates, where you had increasing density after the felling, do you think this is an impact of you're creating disturbance, so you're creating weird new resources, or are you just lowering the amount of forest, so you're just, there's a smaller area to live, so you artificially increase density? Or is it just noise between the sampling?
No, well, so it's definitely not a smaller area, because the area size didn't change. So we used the same density estimate, like the same habitat mask in the second analysis. The question is really hard to answer, Josh, because we had anticipated using a control site, in which case, you know, any changes in food availability, etc., would be kind of accounted for by doing that better experimental design. But in the control site, because of the differences in food availability, when we were doing the trapping, we only trapped one squirrel, so we didn't really have a control site. So you're looking at differences in density, but it's really hard with all the confounding factors to actually say whether that's due to, you know, the fact that it went up is obviously positive. So we didn't see a decrease in density, but whether it had gone up even more if there hadn't been disturbance, we don't know, because we didn't have a control site. So all we can say, it didn't seem to have a negative impact in that way. But like I said, we are looking now at some different sites and at slightly different times of year as well. So that might give us a bit better insight. Certainly there seemed to be a lot of food availability there, and for the site, the density was just incredibly high. So that, I mean, that was definitely an artifact of the food availability. But yeah, the fact that it went up is obviously a good thing.
So do you think the impact of forestry operations would be different depending on the number of kind of red squirrels, the health of the population? If you've got smaller fragmented populations of red squirrels with similar forestry operations, might it have, or do you think that they would still have that dispersal? And
well, in terms of the forest, the thinning forest operations that we found, I do think that a lot of the behavior that we saw that didn't seem to be so impacted would still hold true for smaller populations. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think we shall wrap up there. So thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their expertise and knowledge, and it's been a great session, and well done for answering all of the techie questions and all of the questions that came up. It's been brilliant. And thank you to everyone that joined us today, or to those that may be watching the recording. I'll make the webinar available on our YouTube channel to watch and share, along with other useful videos. We're planning, as I mentioned, we're planning an update on our grey squirrel fertility control research. So if you want to ask any more questions about that, do join our APHA team in May, and keep an eye out on our website for details about that. So thanks again to all our speakers and participants, and good night for now.